South Africa's Free Market Foundation has announced that it will be approaching the courts to compel the country's lawmakers to review some aspects of labour relations regime in South Africa. These include collective bargaining and other collective bargaining agreements. Joining us to discuss their court challenge is Lowe. He's the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation. But first, we take a look at recent opinions about collective bargaining in South Africa.
When you have a negotiation which is done at the sectorial level, or sometimes that's done by the large, who are the companies that are more sophisticated, stronger, that can maybe stand more flexibility in the labor markets and pay better wages or whatever, have more benefits? The larger companies, typically exporters, they negotiate with their big unions, big companies, big unions. They do their generous agreements. And then the logic that follows in many countries, and to some extent here in South Africa, is that agreement has to apply to everybody else. You say, why? Well, because that's it. That's the way it works. You know, the unions will apply it automatically. Well, the problem is, I have a small and medium enterprise. I don't export. I produce for the domestic market. And I am trying very hard to keep my workers, not to fire them because, you know, there's a slower growth. I'm doing my best, but I cannot increase the benefits or the wages in the same way which this exporter would now have the commodities are at the highest price ever, etc. I cannot do that. I cannot replicate. Therefore, I should have the flexibility, because they're basically condemning me if I have to copy the deal that was done by somebody else to bankruptcy. So basically say, you know, get more specific in terms of what are the specific conditions of each company.
Of course, the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, was present when the OECD made these presentations. This is what he had to say about the value of collective bargaining.
If you look at other examples of bargaining systems, clearly the events in the platinum industry taught us that our labor relations system wasn't resilient enough or didn't become strong enough to ensure that the platinum sector had a collective bargaining agreement. I mean, Mr. Gurria has expressed his views about collective bargaining, but the lack of a collective bargaining agreement on the platinum side was a major cause for some of the events that we were confronted with in that particular industry, which my colleague, Mr. Shabangu, is now remedying, both in terms of the spirit in that particular industry, but also the kind of framework that they want to actually work with.
Of course, we've heard there the views of two different people on the value that collective bargaining brings to the process of regulating South Africa's labour relations. Now, of course, the challenge, two aspects of that regime is being brought by the Free Market Foundation, and I'm now joined in the studio by its Executive Director, Lowe. Mr. Lowe, thank you so much for joining us here on Beyond Markets. Very quickly, summarise the essence of your challenge and which particular aspects of the labour law regime you are, you know, considering bringing action against.
Yeah, that's probably easiest clarified by pointing out that the two of them were not talking about the same thing. The OECD was talking about the application of collective bargaining agreements to non-parties, and the Minister was talking about collective bargaining agreements. Now, neither the OECD nor we are objecting to collective bargaining agreements. On the contrary, we're 100% in favour of them. The issue is that what they amount to is an agreement between A and B, big unions and big labour, as the OECD report pointed out. And then two people get together, you and me, for example, and we make a contract that binds our competitors. So firstly, labour law is the only exemption to the idea that there should be no collusion. These are collusive agreements, we must understand. But even worse, it's when you apply the collusive agreement to the non-colluder, the non-party. We are challenging the application to non-parties, which means the unemployed and small business, which means mostly in South Africa black business, which has been absolutely devastated. We have 7 million unemployed people. We have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or even millions millions of businesses, small businesses, put out of business by the very thing the OECD was talking about. By all means, have collective agreements. That is not under challenge, that is not even under debate. It's the application of those agreements to parties who weren't involved. Now, we think it is entirely unconstitutional for private people to enter into a contract which is then a law binding on other people. Private people basically making law, two parties to a contract. That is completely unacceptable, and that is the specific issue we're challenging, which devastates small business and is a big explanation of the high level of unemployment. There are other concerns we have, but that is the specific issue being challenged here.
Explain to me, Mr. Leon, the rationale of taking it to the Constitutional Court, because of course you are going to be arguing, and I'm not a lawyer here, but that this law in fact is unconstitutional and doesn't pass constitutional muster. Is that the case? And if so, what in the Constitution supports your claim?
Yes, well, firstly, what in the Constitution calls for the separation of powers. But certainly if laws are to be made, they should be made by the legislature. We do allow far too much law, in our opinion, to be made by the executive, by decree, by regulation. But nonetheless, that can be done too. But here you have a law being made by private people. It can't be constitutional to have private people making laws that bind other people. This is what we say.
But isn't that the application of the law rather than those who make the law?
Because no, it's a private contract.
It's a private contract, but it's legislated through the legislature.
Yes.
And that is an arm of government that is allowed to do that. So are you not confusing issues?
No. Let's say, for example, the legislature makes a law that says from now on we are going to allow Pick n Pay to make laws governing consumers, or governing Woolworths, governing its competitors. That would be unconstitutional. You can't have Parliament delegating its lawmaking function to private people, especially delegating the ability, the power to make laws governing their own competitors. This is literally like saying Woolworths can make laws that govern Pick n Pay. Or it would be like saying Anglo-American can make laws governing its competitors. You wouldn't, that would be completely and obviously unacceptable.
Now, my understanding, of course, is that there is a process in Parliament at the moment where a series of amendments are being offered in terms of the current Labour Relations Act. Have you had a look at those amendments, and do you believe that your challenge is important notwithstanding that process? You don't feel accommodated in that process?
Oh, we have great concerns about what's being proposed. It will also exacerbate and make massively increase the likelihood of unemployment, which is very simple. If you raise the cost of something, people buy less. If you raise the cost of labor, if you make it more expensive, difficult and dangerous to employ people, less people will be employed. I spent this weekend on a farm near Hoedspruit where 400 workers were laid off and replaced by machines in anticipation of the extension of labor law, of certain aspects of labor law to those farmers. So that is a difficult thing. We are not, however, challenging that. We're challenging a very specific, as you always do in a constitutional case, a very specific issue. You can't just challenge law in general, labor law in general. You have to say which aspect of labor law, and certainly we hope that this will never get to court. We hope that the unions and the government will sit down with us and accept the fact that this is quite unacceptable, it's devastating, and negotiate an amendment to the law, and then we will move on to other concerns that we have.
Now, the idea that the matter doesn't go there and that you use this as a bargaining chip to get people to discuss issues and get them to the negotiating table. Take us through the process that you've engaged to get a table set up in the first place. The labour movement in South Africa is very militant, very organized, and I can't imagine them taking kindly or agreeing to what you're asking for. Take us through some of the ways in which you hope to engage them and to avoid a court battle.
Well, actually the unions will be by far the biggest beneficiaries, because if you can increase the unemployment in South Africa by having 7 million unemployed people with jobs, by far the biggest beneficiaries will be unions, who will get more members, and we hope the unions will actually support this, because they will not only have more members, double or treble the current number, but they will have members with rising incomes and people who can afford union
But have you
dues.
met with them? Are you inviting them to a process, Mr. Leon, as a
What
final question?
we certainly have in the past had dealings with the unions, but not on this particular issue. What we're hoping is that if we just went to the unions and to the government and said, let's talk, they would probably not engage with us in good faith. That's why we need the leverage to say, if you don't sit down and talk to us, you're going to face a constitutional battle, which you will probably lose. This is very improbable that they would win. And when I say they, we think the biggest victims of this system are the government. It has had more unrest, more labor-related unrest, more downtime, more strikes, more pay demands than happened during the anti-apartheid struggle.
Indeed.
So that we think the government and the union should absolutely support us.